From 2001 to 2020, Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft traded blows in an endless battle of hardware and software. The console wars followed the same business pattern that rules nearly all consumer electronics, where winners rarely stay on top. The leader of one generation would almost always stumble in the next, brought down by hubris, disruption, or both. Whatever market share they lost would get immediately absorbed by their rivals, who would seize this opening to rise to the top, only to eventually stumble in different ways. The early 2000s was ruled by Sony, who dominated with the PS2. Their success attracted Microsoft, who spent billions to buy a seat at the table and kickstarted an arms race over graphics and power. This forced Nintendo to retreat to the casual, non-gamer market, but by the mid-2000s the leaderboard had flipped. The Xbox 360 birthed cover-based shooters like Gears of War, defined the modern multiplayer experience with Halo, and elevated video games into art with Bioshock. Sony countered with PS3 exclusives like Uncharted and God of War 3, but the Xbox would ultimately win the hype and headlines in this generation. Yet the order would reverse once more in the mid-2010s, with Microsoft falling into the trap of its own success and Sony taking back its spot at the top. Now a decade later, in the mid-2020s, the console wars have ended, not with a bang, but a whimper. As a distant third in hardware sales for 2 consecutive generations, the Xbox today is barely part of the conversation. These days, there aren't even enough Xbox owners for Microsoft to sell to. As a result, the iconic franchises that made Xbox so special in the first place have been devalued to the point that they must be ported to the PlayStation and Switch to turn a profit. Microsoft has reduced Xbox to a rent-seeking, platform-agnostic publisher, but rather than upholding the creativity, quality, and prestige that made people loyal to the Xbox in the first place, they've done the exact opposite, shuttering studios left and right, pushing out unfinished slop to fill subscriptions, shoving microtransactions at every turn, and harvesting engagement to appease shareholders. In this modern MBA episode, we'll cover the 4 eras of Xbox and how the rise and fall of the console is a timeless case study on politics, monetization, and the dangers that arise when competition disappears. From 2001 to 2004, the Xbox was in its first era. Raw, unproven, but fueled by unmatched capital and corporate aggression. This was the period of the dot-com boom. Microsoft was under siege on multiple fronts. First was the US government, who threatened to break up the company under antitrust concerns. Then the emergence of the internet, which offered consumers and developers far more exciting, engaging experiences online than the Windows desktop ever could. And finally, the rise of open-source software like Linux. While Microsoft would ultimately emerge battered but victorious, these existential threats all revealed the fragility of Windows in the era of the public internet. As the world shifted away from operating systems and towards applications and browsers, any non-Windows device that could get consumers online meant one less Windows license, one less developer in the Win32 ecosystem, and less money for Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer. At the time, Sony was surging with the PlayStation 2. Microsoft cared less about gamers and more about stopping the PlayStation. In their eyes, the PS2 was not a console, but instead a dangerous, non-Windows computer spreading through living rooms worldwide. If Sony was to add Linux, a keyboard and mouse, and a web browser, this harmless Japanese gaming toy and DVD player could quickly transform into a low-cost Windows replacement. It didn't help that Sony marketed the PS2 in the same way, asserting their CPUs to be more powerful than Intel's. From this lens, the Xbox was a defensive play. Microsoft was willing to lose billions to make sure Sony wouldn't own the living room. They followed the same playbook they had used to conquer enterprises and data centers in prior decades. The first Xbox was a tank, with an industry-first 8GB hard drive when the PS2 only supported 8MB memory cards, a custom NVIDIA processor that rendered Dolby sound in real time so players could pinpoint enemy footsteps based on their in-game direction, and a built-in Ethernet port. Compared to the GameCube and PS2, which were designed and positioned as toys, the Xbox was built like a PC with the most powerful internals on the market. But all this power would be pointless without games that could take advantage of all this hardware. In the run-up to launch, Microsoft stole Bungie from under Apple's nose in search of a platform-defining hit. Halo exceeded all expectations as a launch day exclusive, genre-defining title, and technical showcase with sprawling environments, reflective textures, water ripples, ultra-smart enemies, and fast-paced multiplayer. To drive adoption, the Xbox was priced the same as the PS2, which had already been on the market for over a year. But since the Xbox was made from off-the-shelf Intel and Nvidia components, Microsoft lost $125 on every console sold. In contrast, the PS2 and GameCube were not as aggressive of loss leaders. Sony made their own chips. They owned the fabs and iterated on their in-house components fast enough to turn a profit on every PS2 sold by the mid-2000s. Meanwhile, Nintendo architected its own silicon and designed the GameCube to break even despite selling for less. Gaming consoles are based on the classic razor blade business model, where companies generally sell hardware at cost or at loss and make their money back on the refills and add-ons that make the device usable in the first place. With 6 times the units sold, the largest player base, the biggest library, a $7 to $10 royalty off every third-party game, and a slim profit on every PS2 Slim sold, the PlayStation division in this era was Sony's crown jewel. On the other hand, Nintendo sold fewer GameCubes than Xbox, but turned a profit as soon as the player bought a single game. Because Nintendo develops and publishes a large share of its own titles, the company consistently captures the highest profit margins, regardless of unit sales or player base. Ultimately, Nintendo was not focused on winning the living room, yet the GameCube had still been a disappointment given how many N64 players were lost to the PS2. The real money for them was in handhelds. The Game Boy Advance was cheaper to make, more profitable, and delivered the same high-margin first-party sales and third-party royalties across a player base that was just as big as the PS2. Under this lens, Microsoft was the outlier. They had bought their way to performance and in doing so, earned the worst unit economics. With every console sold at a 3-figure loss, Microsoft needed Xbox players to spend far more than PS2 and GameCube players just to break even. As a result, they charged the most for controllers and accessories from the get-go to reduce this deficit as quickly as possible. Still, everyone knew that software would be the only way to black, but this model only works if you have the games that people want to play. If you don't have the games, you don't have the players. If you don't have the players, you don't have the developers. And if you don't have the developers, you don't get royalties. Halo alone would never be enough to sustain the business. If no one else was going to make games for Xbox, then Microsoft would just have to do it themselves. Thus, the only way they could make money in the future was to simply spend more of it today. As the new kid, Microsoft lacked the decades of brand loyalty and legendary franchises of Nintendo and Sony like Zelda, Mario, Metal Gear Solid, and Final Fantasy. With the larger player base, the vast majority of studios naturally prioritized the PS2. It didn't help that Sony immediately went on the offensive to starve Xbox of third-party titles by signing Rockstar, Capcom, Namco, and Disney into exclusivity windows. It would be years before Grand Theft Auto, Devil May Cry, and Kingdom Hearts were ported to Xbox, and anyone who wanted to play these games while they were popular could only do so on a PS2. Microsoft had no choice but to dig deeper into its war chest, funneling hundreds of millions into internal titles like MechAssault, contracting external studios for Splinter Cell, Knights of the Old Republic, Morrowind, Fable, Ninja Gaiden, and acquiring proven developers like Rare. These games were made both for Americans seeking mature Western experiences and to showcase all that the hardware could accomplish. It was a chicken and egg conundrum for what was still a defensive venture. Microsoft had already sunk billions just getting to market only to lose hundreds on every Xbox sold, and now found itself forced to make games under the hope that some of these exclusives would move the needle for gamers and developers. As with any creative endeavor, every game was a coin flip that took years to get to market. Since Microsoft was footing most of the bill, every flop added to an already massive deficit. While the company had no choice but to keep its foot on the gas on game development, they quickly bet the future of Xbox on a different kind of software, one that neither Sony nor Nintendo had ever taken seriously. At $49.99 per year, Xbox Live elevated online gaming. Multiplayer on the PC and PS2 was a Wild West. Players manually scrolled through servers hosted by randoms, signed into a different account for every game, and troubleshooted lag on every session. Xbox Live standardized matchmaking, performance, and social features to unify players across games into a single gated community. Every player got a single identity, friends list, dashboard, and got matched into games by connection and skill level. Xbox Live required broadband internet, which was a radical mandate in an era when 80% of American households were still on dial-up. At the same time, players couldn't just plug in an Ethernet cable. Instead, they had to buy the starter kit, which included headsets. Microsoft envisioned voice chat as the future, and giving away headsets meant that no one would have the excuse of not having the gear to talk in a lobby. Thus, Xbox Live wasn't just about better online play, it was about introducing network effects that would turn one-time customers into lifetime subscribers and lock them in tighter than any individual game ever could. It was horizontal integration that no other console manufacturer had ever attempted. Ultimately, Microsoft was the only company in the world who had the expertise and conviction to execute on such a definitive, commercialized vision. All the muscle that Microsoft had picked up in the 90s building chat lobbies and matchmaking for millions of PC gamers was poured into Xbox Live. This kind of peer-to-peer software had been Microsoft's bread and butter for decades. Xbox Live ran on the same data centers that powered Microsoft's enterprise empire. Its code, architecture, and logic was adapted from other services like MSN Messenger, Hotmail, and Passport. In contrast, Sony and Nintendo both left multiplayer up to individual developers both in inclusion and implementation. They worried that asking consumers to pay for online play would only hurt console sales. Meanwhile, Microsoft was willing to bet that people would be willing to pay for quality and convenience so long as the experience was curated and governed by the platform. They would be proven right just 2 years later with Halo 2. By 2005, Xbox Live had reached over 1 million subscribers. Subscription revenue brought in much-needed cash flow, but Xbox Live still added more to the bill. Whenever Sony discounted the PS2, Microsoft had to price match, which worsened their already terrible unit economics. Thus, while the overall Xbox business grew rapidly through this era, its growth was quickly offset by costs. The division was still losing over $1 billion every year, even though the number of consoles sold and games on the platform had grown substantially. At this point, the Xbox was only in its 3rd year. The average console lifespan was 5 to 6. While there was growth on every other front, there was no way out of the console's core unit economics. It was too dangerous to endure another 2 to 3 years of this generation for the sake of convention. Microsoft had no choice but to fast-track the next generation to get out of its deals with Nvidia and Intel. With new internals, they at least would get a chance to break even on hardware, and this investment piled onto the division's burn rate. In 2005, Microsoft would enter its 2nd era, a golden age for companies and consumers that would last for the next 8 years. The Xbox would evolve from a promising challenger into a disruptive market leader. By throwing in the towel early on the prior generation, Microsoft beat Sony to market, releasing the Xbox 360 a year ahead of the PS3. This period would be the peak of the console wars and when Microsoft would finally turn a profit from their gaming venture. Despite being launched a year prior, Halo 2 was an industry-defining, mass-market blockbuster whose momentum directly carried over to the 2nd generation. The game propelled the 360 and Xbox Live as essentials for mainstream audiences. For Microsoft, the future was online, and the 360 was built to accelerate that. The Xbox dashboard was redesigned into a gamified operating system with tabs, achievements, gamer score, and digital storefronts. Players could download demos or buy mini-games on Xbox Live Arcade. With unified shader architecture, shared memory, and multi-core processing, the 360 pioneered engineering standards and visuals that no other console on the market could replicate. Microsoft had learned enough from its prior era to keep games flowing. They paid off studios to ensure their games would come to Xbox first. There was Call of Duty 2 with HD resolution and volumetric smoke, Elder Scrolls Oblivion with HDR lighting and a massive fully interactive world, Ghost Recon, which could render 2 viewpoints at once, and Gears of War, a genre-defining title for third-person cover shooters. Timed exclusives like Dead Rising, Bioshock, and Mass Effect only further solidified the 360's winning position. These titles helped propel Xbox Live to record subscribers, yet all this success from being first to market would come at a cost. Microsoft had hired IBM and AMD to develop custom chips for the 360. They took a page from Nintendo and kept the blueprints for themselves. But to beat Sony to market and improve on the unit economics, Microsoft cut corners to accelerate production and lower costs. They put the GPU directly underneath the disk drive, the hottest part of the console, opted for cheap aluminum to cool the GPU, and used clips over screws to secure the chip to the motherboard. With inadequate cooling, the 360 would overheat. The clips that held the GPU would snap off as the motherboard warped, and the console would die. Microsoft knew during production that this was a problem as up to 7 out of every 10 consoles failed off the factory line months before launch. Yet company executives still stuck to the release date. The Red Ring of Death was a global epidemic. Millions of consoles failed worldwide, even after multiple repairs and replacements. It was only after scrutiny from the mainstream media that Microsoft finally admitted that the root cause was design, not user error. To protect the upcoming Halo 3 launch and console reputation, Ballmer committed over $1 billion in cash on a proactive mass recall. They covered overnight shipping, extended all warranties to 3 years, retroactively reimbursed repair fees, and swapped motherboards for free around the world. This crisis would have been fatal had it not been for Sony's blunders with the PS3. As a result, Microsoft was allowed to outrun a hardware catastrophe that would have wiped them out in any other era. Microsoft could not bribe every single studio in the world to only make games for the 360. Instead, they were saved by the reality that most studios literally could not develop on PlayStation. Development on the PS3 between 2005 and 2008 was a technical nightmare, so much so that most developers preferred to stay on the 360, even if the underlying console was broken. Sony had initially entered this era as the king. The gaming division was led by Ken Kutaragi, the father of the PlayStation. While Windows was the cash cow that subsidized Xbox at Microsoft, PlayStation was the star at Sony. Despite being late to the party, Sony still held the advantage in player base, IP, and developer support. No matter how great the 360 was, most PS2 players were willing to wait for the PS3. Kutaragi believed that the PlayStation should be elevated into a supercomputer with innovation to last a decade. The PS3 boasted twice as much power, played Blu-ray in an era when high-definition DVD was just taking off, and cost $200 more than the Xbox 360. At launch, Kutaragi proclaimed that the PS3 was not a game machine and that he expected consumers to simply work more to afford the price jump. But the hardware was so complicated that it hindered first-party studios and alienated third-party developers. Cross-platform games like Madden, Tony Hawk, and Splinter Cell looked and performed far worse on the PS3 than on the 360. Developers had to downscale textures, lower frame rate, and remove shadows just to get their titles working on the PlayStation. It was the same for exclusives like Haze, Genji, and Heavenly Sword. There were a few titles like Resistance, Ratchet and Clank, and Metal Gear Solid 4 that nailed the PS3, but these were the exception rather than the norm. As a result, most developers stayed on the 360. Games that were meant to be on PS3 organically turned into Xbox exclusives during the Red Ring of Death. Xbox had escaped disaster thanks to Sony's self-destruction. With gamers reassured, the hardware on a clear path to recovery, and the launch of Halo 3, 2008 was a pivotal year for Xbox. It would be the first time in history that the gaming division would turn a profit, marking the success of a decade-long, multi-billion-dollar bet. At the same time, the 360 dashboard was revamped to be more like the Nintendo Wii, evolving from its cold, 2D aesthetic into a softer, whimsical, 3D interface for casuals. The irony was not lost on Microsoft's leaders that Xbox's best business had come in the Great Recession. They had slashed 360 prices to pressure the PS3, so the money couldn't have come from console sales. Instead, the profit was coming from subscriptions, royalties, and the now blossoming Xbox Live Arcade. Americans stopped shopping, going to the movies, and taking vacations, but they still played video games despite the decline in retail and employment. They simply traded down to $10 indie exclusives on the Xbox Live Arcade like Braid and Castle Crashers. The blowout success of the Summer of Arcade revealed to Microsoft a revenue stream that would prove to be far more lucrative than subscriptions or one-time purchases. Transactional revenue, like downloadable indie games, expansions, map packs, and avatar accessories, had much higher profit margins than the conventional $60 discs that required manufacturing, shipping, and a cut to retailers. And unlike CDs, digital downloads were not transferable. It was a lock-in deeper than any friends list and a direct extension of platform-level LTV rather than franchise LTV. The more online transactions, the greater the user investment and the lower the churn. As Xbox Live Arcade grew in popularity, indie developers started grossing millions of dollars without touching a single CD. The better margins and growing consumer acceptance towards digital distribution became too compelling for major publishers and Microsoft to ignore. By 2010, both sides had united, bringing full games onto Xbox Live for direct download at the same price as retail. For every third-party digital sale, Microsoft's royalty jumped from 10 to 30%, and the publisher's takes leaped from 50 to 70%. By 2011, Microsoft was generating more revenue from online transactions than from Xbox Live subscriptions. It was a clone of the Apple App Store, just applied to gamers. With studios and publishers also hitting their stride with blockbusters like Modern Warfare, Left 4 Dead, Red Dead Redemption, and Assassin's Creed, the Xbox continued its record performance. Microsoft dismissed all talk of a successor console and internally mandated that the Xbox experience be baked into Windows, rather than the other way around. The 360 at this point was 6 years old. It dominated headlines in North America, but would ultimately end this generation as a close second to the PS3. The internet is a market, not an art gallery. Online businesses are brutally competitive, where any bit of success attracts rivals and imitators. Content is no different. On YouTube, every minute someone spends watching another channel is a minute not spent on modern MBA. The growing saturation in business content creates new challenges. Views can be botted, subscriber counts no longer matter, and we have to know what the competition is up to and whether we're falling behind. Audience demand is finite, and being the first to a topic matters more than making the 1000th video on why Subway failed. And when we have plenty of data on YouTube, we get no visibility into how modern MBA content spreads across the rest of the internet. That's where Axio has completely changed the game for us. Everyone talks about AI agents, but unless you go weeding through SDKs, API keys, and access tokens, it's all marketing. Claude and ChatGPT can't even open links. There's no easy way to build an agent that executes exactly what you want until now with Axio. With Axio Work, we created one single agent in just 15 minutes by simply explaining what we need in simple English. We gave our agent 3 tasks, one for each of our business challenges. The first task is tracking distribution. Every 24 hours, it crawls the web on its own, looking for any and every mention of modern MBA outside of YouTube in the past 2 weeks. Then it gives us a daily digest summarizing what videos are spreading across English and non-English markets and how people are reacting. Before Axio, we tried to manually monitor every platform, region, and language, but it would take hours of endless searching to collect just a fraction of these results. And when we tried to ask ChatGPT or Claude, it would just spit out the same outdated results from their training data. Our Axio agent also handles competitive intelligence. It monitors channels similar to modern MBA and summarizes their top-performing videos while tracking any changes in their upload frequency, thumbnails, titles, or format. What's awesome is that our agent looks beyond just videos. It tracks if these creators are launching merchandise, selling courses, paywalling content, or shifting their business model. Instead of manually auditing dozens of competitors weekly, we get a daily snapshot of our entire landscape. The third task is topics. Every day, our agent scans the internet for the latest companies and stories that are gaining momentum in the news cycle. But instead of dumping a list, our agent proactively checks against modern MBA's existing inventory, if similar channels have already tackled the topic, and how those videos have performed to determine if there's any demand left for the topic. Now with Axio, timing can be a strategy rather than just algorithmic luck. We've configured our agent to run every 12 to 24 hours and to maintain memory, track changes over time, and filter for duplicates. At the end of the day, you have to understand the market you're in. You don't need to copy the competition, but you can't operate in a vacuum either. People don't consume, and businesses don't compete in isolation. If you're not tracking where demand is going, you're flying blind. Thanks to Axio Work, we can now monitor competitors systematically, identify opportunities, and understand trends across our vertical without wasting hundreds of hours manually researching everything ourselves. AI tools like Claude are general-purpose chatbots built for the mass market. They help you think, but don't execute. They can't open links, and you have to repeatedly type in the same prompts and context to remind them what you're trying to accomplish. Axio Work is different. It's not a chatbot. It's a specialized AI revenue-generating engine built from the ground up for business owners and entrepreneurs. Trained on decades of Alibaba's proprietary data, Axio Work doesn't just talk. It executes and deploys agents to do the heavy lifting. Download Axio Work for desktop using the link in the description to unlock bonus credits exclusive to modern MBA viewers. Thanks again to Axio for supporting modern MBA and making this episode possible. At this point in the early 2010s, Sony had recovered. The PS3's disastrous debut had forced a reset in leadership, pricing, and marketing. Back in Japan, Kutaragi was demoted. The PlayStation team was no longer allowed to operate independently and was required to collaborate with other divisions. Sony appointed Kaz Hirai, who had shepherded PS2 in the prior era, as the new leader of PlayStation. Under Kaz, Sony would spend the next 2 years with its head down, restructuring the organization and redesigning the console, which gave Microsoft the room to shrug off the red ring of death. Sony shrunk the processors, cut costs, and revamped developer tooling for the PS3. At the same time, their internal studios like Naughty Dog had begun to master the PS3 architecture and started sharing their techniques and knowledge with the technical community. The tides shifted in 2009 with the launch of the $299 PS3 Slim. Backed by Uncharted 2, Demon's Soul, Killzone 2, God of War 3, Gran Turismo 5, and Heavy Rain, these exclusives eclipsed Xbox games in visuals, lighting, physics, and scale. By 2013, the PS3 had surpassed the 360 in sales. But despite losing in hardware, Microsoft still came out ahead in profits. The 360 was a far more effective and efficient business with subscriptions, transactional revenue, and digital stores, income streams that the PlayStation would not tap into until the next era. But for all the fortunes that the gaming division was bringing in, Ballmer needed more. He pushed that the Xbox could and should be more than a console for gamers. There were two realities he was contending with. The first was external. While Xbox and Sony were duking it out, the real winner of this generation was Nintendo. The Wii outsold both the Xbox 360 and the PS3 by tens of millions of units. Nintendo knew it could never compete on specs or match the war chests of Microsoft and Sony. To fight both these giants over the same pool of hardcore gamers was suicide. Satoru Iwata, the president of Nintendo, mandated the company to focus on gameplay and unique controls over chips, graphics, and processing power. The DS was a resounding success, combining established technologies like dual screens, resistive touch, styluses, and microphones in new ways to elevate gameplay. It was more profitable and outsold the PSP by 2-1. The Wii was a continuation of this strategy. Designed with motion control and positioned as a self-improvement appliance, the Wii was both a cultural and commercial hit. At the peak of the console wars, Nintendo was by far the most profitable of the three, selling consoles and games at the highest margins. But even they eventually stumbled. By 2011, smartphones had become mainstream devices. The non-gamers migrated to Angry Birds and Fruit Ninja. The novelty of the Wii had worn off. The console was so underpowered that the cross-platform blockbusters that people did want to play were watered-down ports, and third-party developers felt overshadowed by Nintendo's first-party titles. Nintendo's reign came crashing down in 2012 with the first-ever operating loss in company history. These losses would continue for 3 consecutive years. Not even the 3DS and Wii U could stand against iPhones, iPads, and Androids. By 2014, investors and analysts were heckling for Nintendo to give up on consoles entirely and make Mario games for smartphones. Even though the Wii didn't stay on top, it was still considered the most innovative console of this generation. Nintendo had demonstrated with the right technology and application, consoles could be more than just toys. The market rewarded them for mass-market innovation. At the peak of the Wii, Nintendo's stock had skyrocketed by 400% to become the most valuable company in all of Japan, behind only Toyota, an unprecedented milestone for a video game company. In contrast, as much as Sony and Xbox pushed the envelope for hardcore gamers, they received little recognition from investors. Sony's stock was hammered throughout the PS3 era. The company lost billions in yen every year until Kaz's turnaround. Meanwhile, Microsoft's stock had stagnated under Ballmer for over a decade. While the 360 was a massive story inside the industry, outside, the Xbox was still perceived as a toy for teens and nerds. With the exception of the Wii, Wall Street viewed gaming as a risky, hit-driven business, no different from Hollywood movie studios. It was either boom or bust, and any growth would get wiped out with every new generation of consoles. For all the billions that Xbox generated, their success paled in comparison to the exponential growth of Apple and Google. Ballmer had delivered bigger numbers every year, but was under pressure to deliver the same kind of groundbreaking, mass-market breakthroughs that Microsoft's rivals had achieved. Compared to Fang, Microsoft was a dinosaur. They had money but no strategy or cool factor. The company had been late to every major tech shift of the last decade. They missed out on portable media players and search in the mid-2000s and then ebooks, smartphones, streaming, and cloud in the late 2000s. The Zune was 5 years late and had no shot against iTunes and iPod. Bing derived its minuscule market share by being forced onto Windows and Yahoo users. Ballmer famously laughed at the iPhone, only to panic years later, launching the Windows Phone and acquiring Nokia after Android and Apple had already conquered the market. The same thing happened with MSN and Facebook, Internet Explorer and Chrome, Surface and iPad, Skype and WhatsApp. Under Ballmer, Microsoft was increasingly irrelevant in consumer hardware and software. They had been forced to release these Me Too products to stop their rivals from taking everything. By the late 2000s, the pressure on Ballmer had hit boiling point. Investors publicly called for his removal. Under fire, Ballmer poured all his hopes onto the gaming division. It was the company's only winning horse that wasn't Windows or Office. With an established audience, strong ecosystem, and industry-leading momentum, the Xbox 360 was the perfect vehicle for some kind of bold, game-changing hardware innovation. The success of the Wii and iPhone had only strengthened Ballmer's obsession with natural user interfaces as Microsoft's ticket back to the top. He believed that through Xbox, Microsoft could lead this new world free of mice, keyboards, and screens, one living room at a time. The Kinect was the culmination of all these efforts, a gamble to save Ballmer's job, to deliver an exciting mass-market device, to broaden appeal beyond hardcore gamers, and to re-energize Microsoft in the eyes of shareholders. With Kinect, you became the controller. You could wave your hand to navigate the dashboard, issue voice commands without touching a microphone, sign in with facial recognition, and so on. The futuristic premise of a remote-free living room made Kinect the fastest-selling consumer electronics device in history, ahead of the iPhone and iPad. Microsoft quickly reframed the Xbox as an all-in-one entertainment device to give their new casual audience something to do beyond dancing and gaming, starting with the most timeless living room activity of all, watching TV. Microsoft redesigned the Xbox dashboard to push this new positioning, replacing the classic, glossy, whimsical gamer interface in favor of the flat, minimalist tiles from Windows. By dulling the interface, users would be drawn to the few tiles with color, which were by design the games, streaming apps, and advertisements. The intent was obvious: get users out of the dashboard and funnel all idle engagement into content. Media companies all raced to become first-class citizens on the new Xbox dashboard. By 2012, a third of 360 owners had bought Kinect, and over 100 cable, sports, and entertainment channels were integrated into the homepage. Microsoft proudly proclaimed that for the first time ever, the average Xbox Live user was spending more time watching content instead of playing games. This reaffirming user data, Kinect's record-breaking sales, and the commercial success of the overall gaming business gave Ballmer and Xbox's leaders the illusion that they had finally achieved that radical mass-market breakthrough. The reality was that Microsoft's executives, like most in corporate, ignored history and cherry-picked data to see what they wanted to see. Kinect sold well solely on the basis of being a new, exciting gadget. Like the Wii, once the novelty wore off, most devices just collected dust. Third-party development was also limited. It was difficult to design for the imprecise gestures, input lag, and inevitable player fatigue. The data cited by leadership was also a classic case of survivorship bias. It only captured the behavior of the 360 owners that were online rather than the vast majority that was offline. Ultimately, people watched Netflix, YouTube, and movies on their Xbox because it was already plugged in, not because they didn't care about games. At the same time, the numbers between 2010 and 2012 for the overall Xbox business were truly spectacular for a 7-year-old console. Microsoft incorrectly attributed this performance to Kinect, the new audience of casuals, and increased content consumption. But this was correlation, not causation. In reality, Xbox's success in this period had little to do with TV and Kinect. Instead, most of the money came from the platform's biggest franchises who were all releasing their finales. Halo Reach, Gears of War 3, and Fable 3 all came out in this period. From another lens, it was understandable why Microsoft would be so quick to drink its own Kool-Aid. The Xbox team had a stellar track record in reshaping the industry. They had redefined online gaming into a centralized subscription service, pioneered digital distribution, and built a platform for indie developers years before anyone else. From 2013 to 2019, Microsoft would enter its third era with the fatal misunderstanding that people no longer wanted consoles to play games anymore. This mistake would be the beginning of the end for both Xbox and Steve Ballmer. The long-awaited Xbox One reveal was a disaster. Priced at $500, the console came with a slew of radical requirements. First, Kinect was now mandatory and had to be connected at all times for the console to even turn on. Second, Xbox would check internet connection every 24 hours. If the console was not online, users would be blocked from playing games, even offline single-player titles, until the internet was restored. The classic CD was now just a license. Third, every game had to be fully installed to the hard drive and tied to one Xbox account. Players could no longer share discs with friends or buy used games. And with region lock, games of one region could only be played on consoles that had been registered in that same country. To make matters worse, the reveal was more about TV than games. The big announcements were a partnership with the NFL, the promise of a Steve Spielberg live-action Halo TV show, a new network where Microsoft would produce and broadcast its own exclusive programming, and TV-specific voice commands for Kinect. These were all business decisions to normalize digital distribution, maximize transactional revenue from casuals, and optimize engagement for advertisers. The blowback was intense, and Sony quickly capitalized on their rivals' self-destruction. Just 1 week after the Xbox One reveal, Sony announced to standing ovation that the PS4 supported used games, required no internet connection to play offline games, and cost $100 less than the Xbox One. Microsoft hastily abandoned these policies a month later before the console was even released, but the damage had already been done. All the investment had gone into this TV future rather than games. With 4 times the amount of exclusives on PlayStation than on the Xbox, the PS4 would go on to outsell the Xbox One 2-1 for the remainder of the decade. Microsoft had lost the generation before it even started. The disastrous Xbone keynote, combined with the Nokia acquisition, proved fatal for Ballmer. Satya Nadella was appointed with a mandate to usher in change. Investors demanded a reset. They called for an end to the billions wasted chasing Apple and Google, a ruthless optimization of the Windows and Office cash cow, a singular focus on Azure Cloud for growth, and a spin-off of Xbox. Satya was faced with 2 choices. He could either sterilize Microsoft into a safe but boring enterprise relic like IBM, or take another stab at bringing the company back to the forefront with exciting consumer products. The former would be a slow walk to the graveyard, while the latter would be another high-stakes gamble for the legacy giant. Ultimately, the best way to grow the stock was not by adding a few $100 million more in revenue or issuing greater dividends. Ballmer had already tried that for a decade. Instead, Satya had to win the optics. Investors had to see the company as a growth stock like FANG, and keeping Xbox was key to maintaining relevance amongst consumers. To demonstrate that Microsoft would no longer be the same greedy, out-of-touch dinosaur, Satya did in his first year what Ballmer had refused to do for decades: releasing Microsoft Office for iPad, open sourcing .NET, taking a photo in front of a Linux sign, and releasing Visual Studio for free. He gave Xbox the same treatment, firing the TV execs and appointing an Xbox lifer in their place as a show of goodwill to gamers. Satya had made his career at the company scaling Azure, and he pushed Microsoft to embrace a software-first business. Microsoft had been losing the war in hardware for generations, and to him, consumer devices like gaming consoles were high risk, low margin, and near impossible to get right. Instead, the real financial engine of FANG and the biggest tech startups was software as a service. Apple's true business was not in the glass and aluminum of the iPhone, but rather in the recurring revenues of the App Store and iCloud, and Satya pushed Microsoft to do the same across consumer and enterprise. Despite Phil Spencer's public efforts, the Xbox One had fallen so far behind in 2017 that it was clear that Microsoft would never catch up to PlayStation. With the launch of Xbox Live Anywhere and Game Pass, the gaming division embraced Satya's cloud-first, platform-agnostic SaaS endgame. They stopped caring what devices people played their games on, so long as they owned the user data and monetization. Engagement, rather than units sold, became the new defining metric for all of Xbox. Under this model, even first-party flops like Halo 4 and 5 and Gears of War 4 and 5 were all framed as major successes for their engagement rather than gameplay or reception. On the other hand, Game Pass was a direct copy of the Netflix playbook. The price was aggressively subsidized, and the catalog was so stacked that it was impossible for players to not sign up. Microsoft poured capital into anything that could drive engagement, acquiring studios like Mojang, Obsidian, Double Fine, and Ninja Theory on top of a live streaming platform. Success was no longer an endless race to deliver the next hit, but instead adding enough content every quarter to grow engagement and collect rent. By late 2018, Microsoft only reported 2 metrics for its gaming business: MAU and gameplay hours. Thus, even as consumer reception to first-party titles declined, Microsoft no longer had a reason to care about how players felt about the games so long as they stayed engaged. The Xbox division surpassed a record $10 billion in revenue, despite being completely crushed in hardware by the PS4. Even though PlayStation had won, their overall business was nowhere as effective or efficient. From the standpoint of gamers, Sony had done everything right. They doubled down on single-player titles in a time when the industry chased multiplayer, funded high-budget exclusives like Bloodborne and Spider-Man, and paid for timed exclusives on third-party blockbusters to cement PlayStation as the only home for gamers. While Microsoft picked up studios right and left in the pursuit of quantity, Sony's internal studios were given progressively longer runways and larger budgets to deliver quality. The company treated first-party exclusives like timeless art and believed that bundling them into subscriptions would devalue their worth. Ultimately, it was a case of opposites. Microsoft was extracting far higher spend and margins from its smaller audience under subscriptions and services than Sony was with its much larger customer base under the old-school hardware and ownership model. In 2020, the Xbox entered its fourth and present-day era where the chickens have come home to roost. To drive software and devalue hardware, Microsoft spent $69 billion to buy Activision Blizzard. With 240 million monthly Candy Crush players and a controlling stake in mobile gaming, Microsoft now monetizes the users on the devices of its biggest rivals. And as the new owner of Call of Duty, Microsoft now owns the most played game on PlayStation and pockets 70% of every microtransaction that occurs on Sony hardware. However, now that the cash has been spent and interest rates have climbed, Satya Nadella is under pressure to return that $69 billion to shareholders. In the prior era, the low interest rates and SaaS gold rush enabled the Xbox division to focus on growth at all costs, where Game Pass subscriptions were given away for free and dozens of studios were funded to make something for everyone. Meanwhile, the hardware strategy was allowed to completely wither away. These days, the Xbox is a ghost on Microsoft's own storefronts and properties. The sales gap between it and the PS5 have widened to a staggering ratio of 3-to-1. There are simply no longer enough Xbox owners for Microsoft to sell first-party exclusives to. This reality has forced a radical pivot where iconic franchises that once defined the Xbox experience like Halo, Forza, and Gears of War are now being ported to the PlayStation under the cold logic that any money in software is good money. With console sales and consumer trust in the dirt, the entire Xbox business today rides on Game Pass. To extract maximum value, Microsoft has pushed price hikes and membership tiers. Like Netflix, their entire bet hinges on the thesis that subscription in itself is a moat, that people won't churn due to convenience, and that when you own most of the content in the first place, it really doesn't matter how much of it is slop. At the same time, every internal studio has been placed under a mandate to achieve 30% profit margins. Creatives who stuck around under the promise of autonomy have all been pushed out. Perennial underperformers like 343 Industries have been promoted for their obedience and ability to be franchise factories, and award-winning developers like Tango and Arcane have been shuttered as cultural and economic liabilities. Xbox today stands for neither good hardware nor good games, only liquidation. Ultimately, Satya was successful in his grand goal of transforming how investors perceived Microsoft. Under him, Microsoft's stock has consistently traded at double the PE ratio of when the company was run by Ballmer. Ironically, Satya promised at his appointment to usher in a culture of open source, empathy, and product excellence over the closed, clinical value extraction of the 90s. Over his tenure, he did enough on the PR front to appoint the right talking heads for Xbox, leaders who wore the t-shirts, pounded their chests, and said all the right things to appease gamers and regulators. But now that Satya has won over investors, he no longer needs to curry favor with consumers, and Xbox's leaders have all been swiftly replaced with yes men and yes women who will execute on his profit mandates and have no loyalty to anything beyond their own careers. In hindsight, while Ballmer deserves plenty of criticism for the Xbone, at least he was trying to grow the pie. Today, it's the worst of all worlds, where engagement is more important than quality, talent is expendable, and products are built to kill time rather than excite consumers. Hardware is for suckers, and risk-taking is for losers. Under this mindset, the original Xbox would have never existed. And despite talking up Microsoft as being a software-first company for over a decade, its other consumer products, Windows, Outlook, 365, and Surface, have followed the same path as Xbox as hollow, rent-seeking subscriptions. It's bad to generalize, but the other angle is that gamers have repeatedly proven to be a forgiving audience with short memory, quick to outrage, but also easy to placate and win back. Xbox fanboys are now shouting from their soapboxes that the console wars are back, and Asha Sharma is the right leader to return the console to its glory days. She's lowered Game Pass prices, removed Copilot from the dashboard, renewed a commitment to platform exclusives, and handed out free consoles to conference attendees. The reality is that these moves are just band-aids designed to soften the impending layoffs and budget cuts that are about to sweep over the entire division. In her own words, Xbox today operates at an unacceptable 3% profit margin. The entire business is currently being kept afloat by Call of Duty slop and Candy Crush microtransactions. Asha's tenure, compensation, and career as the head of Xbox won't be decided by Twitter headlines and player sentiment. Instead, her job security rides entirely on one thing: how quickly can she lift the business out of this 3% margin, and how high can she drive profits using the least amount of investment? In her own words, Satya has spent $20 billion in the past 5 years, and he's not about to give a penny more to gaming. From this lens, her promise to restore Xbox as a leader is just window dressing for the gullible and naive. It's hard enough to develop quality first-party exclusives, foster a thriving third-party ecosystem, or push the boundary in hardware. Attempting all three while slashing the division to the bone is impossible. All of these efforts, if properly pursued, require time, capital, expertise, and talent, things that Xbox has lost over the past decade and can no longer afford. What Asha is doing today is no different from any executive, which is picking the easy, low-hanging fruit that requires no conviction, no vision, and no risk. Appeasing the masses is not a strategy. The fall of Xbox is the best modern-day reminder of the importance of competition and that monetization is no replacement for product. The console wars of the 2010s were not just entertainment for gamers, but a pressure cooker that compelled innovation. When Sony fumbled the PS3, when Microsoft botched the 360, and when Nintendo messed up with the Wii U, they were each forced to redeem themselves through innovation. And in doing so, they gave consumers some of the best titles, features, experiences, and hardware in gaming history. Today, the urgency and incentive for innovation rides solely on the personal values and ethics of every company's leaders.